So we're joined today by Chris Bell. He's a principal designer currently at Google. I personally got to know him during his tenure at Amazon. He was there for a good 8 years?
11 years, 11 and a half.
Years.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you overshot me. And during his time there, like he's got his own bio on the event page, and I'll give him a second to kind of introduce himself. But just like from my perspective, I always looked at Chris as like the Johnny Ive of like Amazon retail design. Like everything that was standardized somehow had Chris's fingerprints on it. So Chris, can you give the group a quick introduction?
I think first of all, apologies to Sir Johnny. I'm not sure that's quite the apt comparison. But yeah, as Yuri said, Chris Bell, I spent a number of years at Amazon across a whole bunch of different spaces. If you ever checked out on Amazon, for example, you might have encountered some work of mine. I've been in design for 20-ish years. I designed my first web page and built it in Notepad in 1996, and it's sort of been headed in that direction ever since. Yeah, I live in Seattle. I work at Google now, working in a completely different space in cloud security, which is a whole set of different challenges. And I'm just excited to be here and talk to everyone today. So thanks for having me, Yuri, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for joining us. Like I'm a little starstruck just to have you here. So thank you. So like I decided to make the topic of today's talk design systems, just because it keeps on popping up in the group. We're gonna kind of expand beyond that, but just to get us started, from your point of view, having worked on multiple, not just worked within design systems, actually like built them from the ground up, like up to like a lot of complexity and a lot of stakeholders. Like, can you talk us through what a design system is and when you use one?
Yeah, well, I think it's the first thing I would point out is that it has been a bit of an evolving definition for the last number of years. I think within design, when some of us were starting out, in the late 90s or 2000s even, design systems weren't really a thing yet. And I think they've only really become sort of fairly well defined in the past 5 years or so. And in fact, the very first design system that I worked on, I don't think that term was even in vogue yet, and we were referring to it as a HIG, or just a set of front-end components. But I actually really like, so to get down to the definition, I think there's a bunch of them, but the one that I really go to again and again is the definition from Nathan Curtis, who's sort of a guru out there on design systems and can speak to design systems with about 10 times the amount of authority and just smarts that I can. So I'll steal from him, but basically he says that design systems are really three things. I think one is a set of reusable building blocks, a set of interconnected parts. The second thing the design system is a set of cohesive products. And the third is sort of the community that surrounds a design system. And so that kit of parts is essentially what we think of as those building blocks that enable someone to compose and interface buttons and form fields and grids and things like that. But that's usually not enough to actually have a design system. You also have to have, the design tools and the build systems and the documentation that goes along with it, so people actually understand how to use those parts. And then the third part, that community, is super important, because without it, you don't get the feedback, you don't get the contribution that you actually need to keep it as a sort of a thriving tool. That's sort of like, in my mind, the canonical definition. And I would always sort of like defer to Nathan Curtis. I think the other way, that's a sort of bottoms up definition, though. It sort of tells you what a design system is based on these three things that make it up. I think from a top down perspective, though, a design system is also a product. So it is an offering that a team inside of an organization makes to the designers and the builders within an organization. And you know, in and of itself, it's a product that has to be sort of treated like any other product, that has to be marketed, that has to be advertised, that has to be nurtured, you know, in order to make it successful. So it's sort of all of those things together.
And to just to expand on that, like at what point, you know, I feel like design system as nomenclature can be used loosely, and sometimes it's just referring to a sticker sheet, and sometimes it's like referring to a really, really complex you know, set of guidelines. It's like, what is like is something as simple as just like aligning with people on a sticker sheet a design system, and what's the difference between human interface guidelines and a design system?
Yeah, great question. I think, you know, like you know, I personally wouldn't sort of want to be too rigid about the definition. I think somebody who works within a small organization that has a sticker sheet, that has all those personal connections within an organization in order to get the feedback that they need, in order to sort of evangelize the design system, and in order to provide that documentation or tools in other ways, could probably get by with calling it a design system. But I think ultimately, as an organization grows, it's hard to call something like a sticker sheet a design system, because a sticker sheet in and of itself doesn't scale. And so you sort of lose the system piece of it in a way. And I think that ultimately gets at why we've actually moved to design systems sort of out in the world as a means of making digital interfaces. It's because we are doing so in such a connected, complex world now that has to operate at scale, that we have no choice but to create a robust, fully rounded system that's going to do a bunch of the sort of differentiated or undifferentiated heavy lifting for us. So I wouldn't want to get caught up in the definitions too much, but I would argue that a sticker sheet's not going to scale in a way that a design system ought to. So.
Okay, so just riffing off of that. So like, you know, you join an organization and they've got, you know, a couple sticker sheets floating around, and that's like all the reference that the designers really have, and you're ready to come in and bring order and kind of like evolve, like take the design system to the next level. How do you do that? Like, how do you actually effectively deploy and kind of kick that exercise off, and when is the right time to start one?
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two, in my experience, I've sort of gone through both of these. There's usually two ways or two contexts in which you're finding yourself. I think one is in which you're sort of coming in and there's some stuff in place, maybe a sticker sheet, maybe a pattern library. And, you know, you're coming in as a, you know, really sort of asked to turn this into a product. I think the other situation that people find themselves in is like, you're so far ahead, you're sort of the tip of the spear, such that you don't have to take anything that existed prior, and you're able to come in and create one from scratch. I think in both cases, it starts with understanding fundamentally like what people need from the system that you're going to go out and build. In a case where you're taking an existing, you know, set of, you know, tools or pieces, a sticker sheet or whatever else, it really starts with understanding what people are getting out of that today and what they're building from it. Ultimately, you know, what you don't want to do is you don't want to come in and take that off into a direction that doesn't make sense for the builders that are using it. So sometimes that can mean doing an inventory of products that have been built from that sticker sheet, and then looking for the deltas between sort of what exists and what doesn't exist and what needs to exist. Sometimes it means looking at the deltas between what has been documented and what hasn't, and adding that documentation. Sometimes it means looking at the deltas between what tools are provided in terms of, you know, a sketch sticker sheet or a Figma library, or, you know, some sort of front-end technology that hasn't been used, and then shoring that up. And so sometimes it just means simply finding those gaps. You know, when you're starting new, it means chartering a course for all of it, all together at once. And that also means understanding fundamentally what your designers need from a kit of parts, what they need from documentation, what your engineers need, what front end technologies they're building with, or want to build with, and then putting forward an entire project plan that's going to basically fill all of those needs together.
And do you kind of start that like as soon as you join the team, you kind of like, find a couple just like design partners and start to do it like on the side before starting to evangelize it? Or do you evangelize while you're kind of kicking off that auditing process?
I mean, the earlier you can get people involved and on your side, the better it's going to go. That's but both from a, it's really interesting because design systems are, I mentioned the community part at the beginning. The community is also your users. And so the feedback loop between all of the individuals who are sort of involved with this is super, super tight. And you're both listening to them in order to build something for them, but you're also partnering with them. So the earlier you can get people involved, those who are going to use it, the better. You not only get the right signals early enough in the process that you can make good decisions, but you can also use those folks as missionaries for the system that you're ultimately going to build.
And does that include like, whoever you're reporting into and like giving, hints to senior layers that, hey, like there's a new design system coming, or do you save that for later?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because then that would create like pressure on you, right? Like
yeah.
Do you create that pressure ahead of time, or do you avoid that?
I mean, the way that I think anybody who's working in an organization needs to approach this is their activities need to reflect the priorities and sort of organizing principles and culture of the organization that it's meant to serve. So at Amazon, for example, I worked on a net new design system for the operation and logistics space. Amazon's sort of a fairly top-down organization insofar as a lot of leaders sort of dictate what the work for their given team is going to be, as opposed to it sort of being developed organically, bottoms up, which is more of the Google way. So at Amazon, it was we sort of when we were building this net new design system over in operations, we both found our missionaries inside of the organization. We did so by, again, sort of getting deep with folks early on. We did some, like a couple months into building out the sort of first set of components for the design system. We got a bunch of designers to come in and use them to actually sort of spec out interfaces, and they became evangelists for us. At the same time, we had to make an appeal to that sort of leadership level, and sort of, explain to them why this was going to be beneficial to them, so that they could also help us in a top-down manner and ask their teams to actually go and use this. And the appeal that we made was largely one of engineering efficiency. We sort of did a bunch of work to demonstrate how this could enable their builders to build. I think, we did some back of the napkin sort of math, like 25% faster, and then, sort of look at that at the through the lens of the numbers that they had in their organization, and sort of put some rough figures on paper in order to convince them. And then that sort of bottoms up and top down sort of squeeze the middle, and sort of really helped us get some folks on board really fast.
And I love that in order to get their support and in order to convince them, like, you spoke their own language. You didn't come in, like trying to speak designese to them and trying to explain what, and, speaking to like just the raw UX component of it. Like you made it about like resourcing and like, look at how design can actually, streamline an entire organization, not just a product.
Yeah, I mean, a design system ultimately, I think, serves two primary goals. I think one of those is to help teams build faster with a high degree of quality. And the other is to make sure that there's a consistent brand and interaction expression. The former is one that appeals to a lot of leaders, much more than the latter. So, I mean, on the engineering side specifically, if you can tell somebody that their back-end engineers don't have to spend a ton of time building out the front end and all of the nightmares that go along with sort of the QA, those little display bugs. I mean, that's a big selling point. And so that was where we really focused our energy. And I think if you can get engineering teams on board, to use a design system while also sort of giving designers the pieces that they need, then it all sort of comes together really, really, really easily.
Yeah, because then it's not even like you trying to speak on the behalf of engineering. Like if they're along for the ride, then engineering can kind of like chime in and be a supporting partner, and kind of also equally be pushing it along, right? Then it's not just you trying to move them out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In my years working in design systems, both in the operation space, and then I did a bunch of stuff for the Amazon retail front end. I found that so sometimes you get passionate engineers on board, and they become even greater evangelists for the design system than designers are, because they have such a self-interest in just doing things fast and quality and sort of reducing the pain in their own lives. So
yeah,
you got to find your missionaries anywhere you can get them.
I remember experiencing that myself once when I was on Amazon Gaming. We had a pretty small surface area product that we were working on, but I spun up a small design system, and to my surprise, the biggest evangelist and supporter ended up being the front end engineer, and not even other designers. So that's totally true. Last question for you is specifically in the design system vein of things, is like what are some mistakes that you see others make with design systems?
Yeah, I think like the biggest mistake that I see, and I've done this myself. There's plenty of blame to go around here, and I'll be number one to raise my hand, is that you don't treat the design system as a product. It's like when the very first time that I worked on a design system was probably 2013 or so, and at that point, this was at Amazon. At that point, we had a front end framework, and that's all it was. And then I wasn't too deep into designing that piece, but what I was asked to do was come in and sort of flesh out the documentation and the tools piece of it. And at the time, we didn't call it a design system. I created the set of human interface guidelines for it. We ended up having like two sites. One was an engineering focused documentation site around how to actually build with this thing. And then we had this other design focused set of human interface guidelines off the side. Those two things were often out of sync. They were sometimes in conflict. Engineering, design weren't always speaking to each other, and we certainly weren't marching to a common roadmap. And so what ended up happening, and it was completely under-resourced on both sides. We didn't provide a roadmap as to what we were going to do out to the public. We didn't sort of really invest a ton in marketing out to designers and engineers to get them on board. And what happened, and then I decided I was going to take a different job in the organization. And what ended up happening is like a bunch of this stuff languished over time. The documentation was no longer fresh. Things had evolved on the engineering side that wasn't reflected in the documentation. People became confused. People lost faith and lost trust. And that, I think, is sort of the biggest mistake that you can make with any design system. I think, again, to my earlier definition, that you have to treat it as a product. And that means that you have to work across anybody involved with it to have a single roadmap, that you have to publish that roadmap out and tell folks what it is that they can expect to happen. You have to have a feedback loop, a communication mechanism for actually taking requirements back in and understanding what people need out of it. You need to have version control so that you're not forcing teams to upgrade when they don't necessarily want or need to or can't get it on their roadmap. You need to market it. You need to evangelize it. You need to advertise it, and you need to resource it so that so that over time you continue to get the momentum and you continue to get the efficiencies that you promised. So that's ultimately what you have to do, and where you're going to, I think, is the single biggest point of failure that I've seen teams make.
I want to park there for a second on marketing it, because like I know that there's a lot of roadshowing that happens for like a design system to really hit its stride. Can you speak to like what a design lead can expect if they're truly gonna roadshow and try to get buy-in from a larger organization? And like, what is a roadshow? Like a lot of designers don't even do that, like especially if they're not in a massive company, right? Like if you think about like a small to medium-sized company, what would a roadshow look like?
Well, I mean, I think it does totally depend on, again, what the company is, what the culture is, and ultimately what the design system can do for teams. But any good roadshow needs to ultimately appeal to those needs. And the design system ultimately needs to make sure that it fills those needs. And so as an example, in the ops space, our roadshow really highlighted as I mentioned, sort of the efficiencies that teams would gain. It also highlighted a bunch of the freebies that teams would get as a result of adopting it. And so there was some, so one example of those was that we, in the ops design system that I helped drive, we baked dark mode in from day one. And dark mode at Amazon in the ops space is super important because you have delivery drivers out delivering at night, and packages and cars. You've got air traffic control, flight controllers essentially in really, really sort of dark environments with tons of screens up as they watch flight paths go through. And bright interfaces was sort of all they had experienced because they were sort of cobbling it together themselves. And so, of course, there's efficiencies in getting those for free, but the fact that they got them at all and opened up their eyes to sort of the benefits of having those was such a massive selling point. And so it's really about, the pitch is really about sort of just exposing all of those advantages and getting it out there. When I worked last year before I left Amazon on a revamp of some of the front end pieces for the Amazon.com shopping experience. And the pitch there was really about how teams could contribute back to this. Amazon, and this is sort of gets back to my point about any design system needing to be reflective of the organization that it serves. The way that Amazon works is that it's completely matrixed. And so there's sort of a core platform team that does a bunch of the sort of basic stuff, but then there's all these category teams, like clothing or automotive, are sort of driving their own experiences. And they have very specific needs, and a lot of them had gone off and created their own, automotive design system. I don't know if that exists, but that's an example. Those teams want to be a bigger part of the design system, but previously we didn't sort of have a way for them to do so. And so what that meant for Amazon was developing this notion of subsystems, which is, reflective in a way of the Amazon, organizing principles of autonomy and sort of self-control. Subsystem ladders into the central design system. So just selling that got a lot of people very excited.
That makes a ton of sense. And just for people not super familiar with how Amazon works internally, Amazon is fairly fragmented by design, and at a corporate level, it's very comfortable with fragmentation. So I love how Chris, you kind of leaned into that and accepted that as a truth, because a lot of the time, fragmentation is seen as a bad thing. So at least you worked on creating structure that actually was designed for the organization, as opposed to you as a designer trying to force fit something because you are design and you are supposed to be making the rules. Like it's very humble that it actually like was respective of how the organization works.
And I think this is in a way why it's hard sometimes to define what a design system actually is, because the design system needs to have a degree of flexibility, in order to actually serve the organization that it needs to serve. It can't, there's sort of no monolithic archetypal sort of example of what it ought to be. It needs to be what the organization needs it to be ultimately.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to take this a slightly different direction, and then we'll go into Q&A. And a reminder to folks, there's a Q&A feature in Zoom in your toolbar at the bottom. There's Q&A. Feel free to plug questions there. If you're in the Facebook group, make sure to put your questions into the poll and vote on the ones that are already in there, because the questions in the poll are going to take highest priority in Q&A. So last thing I kind of wanted to talk to you a bit about, Chris, is what's the difference between a principal and a senior UX designer? You are, to me at least, like you are like a principal designer of principal designers. Like you are a model principal designer. Like you're a role model. You influence entire organizations, and your work ends up influencing how other designers work. Can you unpack like what it is that a principal designer does? Assuming that they're effective at being a principal.
Yeah, this is actually a question that I've gotten over and over and over and over and over again.
I believe it.
Over the years. And my answer is pretty reductive at this point, but I think there's a sort of a nugget of truth in this, which is I think that principals are designers who have developed an ability to execute through others. And so principals often find themselves driving a vision, and then others sort of pick that vision up and drive it through. And so they're essentially designing through others in a way. I think a senior designer, by contrast, is an exemplar of craft. They're the greatest practitioners within an organization. And oftentimes that leap from senior designer to principal means just sort of going further down the spectrum of the senior designer, using those around them to actually begin to execute on that vision, and then slowly over time moving into a place where they're sort of leading through the vision and less so through the craft. And that means that principals become, to use a super Amazon term, force multipliers in a way, because suddenly instead of their output being the work of one, their output can be the work of 5 or 10 or 30.
So how can a senior designer kind of prepare themselves and begin to grow their kind of principal level skills? Because John Wooden always said it's too late for preparation when opportunity actually strikes. So how is a senior supposed to start to train themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've seen it work over and over and over again is it's harder for folks who are not on a team of other designers. I'll just sort of say that up front. But senior designers who make that leap to principal are the ones who sort of look around and say, I've got these new young designers that are sort of working within my organization, and they're working in products that are adjacent to mine, or maybe even a piece of mine. Rather than them sort of driving their thing in isolation of mine, I'll restructure the work a little bit so that I'm in much more of a leadership position. And so they essentially utilize the people around them instinctively, or in some cases, I guess not as instinctively, but so that's sort of it. You just have to understand what it is that the folks around you are capable of, and then using them for, to sort of to your own ends, I guess. That sounds really opportunistic and weird, but that's kind of true.
Yeah, to balance that out though, can you speak to how, having a principal on the team, how is that person supposed to make a team like the actual, the other designers stronger? Because I feel like another thing that principal is supposed to bring to the equation is kind of team level IC mentorship.
Yeah.
kind of like being like a model citizen that's just like, okay, here, because like half of you, like the majority of your job is really just giving away the credit to stuff that you do, right? Because like it's not ultimately going to manifest in your pixels, it's just going to manifest in the designer's pixels. Can you just speak to the kind of support structure factor?
Yeah. So like sometimes it really is about, you just need more hands on a project. So you get some folks to come and work with you on it, but usually through sort of very traditional hierarchical chains of command. But sometimes it also means just pulling in sort of those around you because you need their input. So my own path to principal at Amazon was when I was working on the checkout space, and I was a senior designer. And checkout is, it may not seem this way for folks who are just sort of users of Amazon, but it's a pretty complex space. There's hundreds of use cases involved, and there's a bunch of teams that sort of integrate there. And so the way that I was able to demonstrate that leadership was I had a couple of people who ended up working for me, and so I was able to pass the execution piece to them and sort of guide them on how getting better at their craft. And that was where I spent a majority of my time. I sort of laid out the big patterns and sort of the overall structure, and then they executed. But then the other thing that we had to do is we had to go around to 30 or 40 different teams at Amazon, the payments team and the subscribe and save team and this team and that, coupons and all of these other things, and sort of work with their individual designers to help them understand how to plug into this new system. And so it was sort of in the right place at the right time, but it can be either one of those, both sort of direct, like you need to sort of do this work on our behalf, or it needs to be like, let me explain to you, fellow designer, how to sort of integrate into this. And so those are sort of, I think, two equally valid ways.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Chris. This was really cool. That concludes the just you and me hanging out talking about stuff leg of the session, and we can start moving into questions. So again, folks, like there's although we already have like 30 questions, so maybe I'll stop encouraging people to ask questions. Let's just go to the Facebook event page and see what is winning on the poll. And first, the highest voted question is, if you were to build a design system from scratch on a small team at a startup, where would you begin? And thanks, Jonathan, for posting that.
Where would I begin? So it's interesting. Yeah, designing something from new means you don't have an inventory of things that you can go sort of break down to figure out what it is you need necessarily. Where I would likely begin would be to do a bunch of, sort of exploratory or spec work into where you think that the system is going to go, or where the product is going to go, and sort of try to think out, a year or two ahead. And then rather than overly focus on whether or not those designs are right, like figure out, well, we think we're going to need these pieces, even if, these pieces meaning these kinds of input elements or these kinds of expando controls or whatever else. And really just sort of try to anticipate the kind of stuff that you think is going to appear within the product, and then start by sort of identifying what those fundamental pieces are and just having a cut line around what you can actually sort of reasonably do in the time that you have. The other thing that you have to do from the beginning, no matter what, is you have to, you can't just go design like your set of buttons or whatever without having a firm perspective on what your visual styles are going to be. And so you will also have to spend a lot of time up front thinking through what is going to be our approach to sort of those foundational visual elements that are going to sort of infuse the rest of your front end components. And so when I worked on the ops design system, and then both on the sort of some of the revamped front end stuff at Amazon that's starting to come out now, we spent a bunch of time just thinking through like a philosophy around color, a philosophy around shape, a philosophy around elevation. What was going to be our approach to accessibility? How are we thinking about, animation and like, easing properties? Sort of all of those things that once you make a decision about them, it just becomes a matter of of sort of pushing them right through everything.
And how do you organize, like, native versus web versus just like whatever other modalities you're doing? Because like some of those things are going to be high level constructs, because like, you're talking about, color and the emotional stuff and depth. But then like, how do you manage having like multiple services?
I think there's oh boy, how much time do we have?
Give me the 1 minute answer.
I think the 1 minute answer is, I think there's two parts of this. I think one is you have to determine your approach to native versus web, meaning how much are you going to lean into a singular approach for both, meaning are you going to design is your native web experience on mobile going to be the same as your app experience? A lot of companies out in the world have gone that direction because it's faster to do so. Or the sort of other way to go would be, then how much are we going to lean into sort of existing SDKs and human interface guidelines from Apple or Android on these. And that's sort of the first path that you have to make a decision about. There's sort of advantages to both. We probably don't have time to sort of get into those deeply. But I think the second thing you have to do then is figure out how do we scale at least the style piece out to all of these things? And so, because that's no trivial matter. One thing that some teams have done out in the world is used a style library or a set of JSON tokens that basically they can define those style properties sort of upstream of any front-end technologies. And so it becomes almost an API or just sort of a service that they can use to then serve those out agnostic of the actual front-end technologies being used. And I think as a organization becomes much more complex and starts to begin having native experiences versus HTML experiences versus whatever else, that becomes just a unifying a way to unify all of those across the board.
Love how you just went like super broad and then extremely
well, yeah. The style library stuff is really, really fascinating. It's actually driven by a guy who, there's a GitHub sort of repo out there that allows you to build one built by a principal design technologist at Amazon.
I've seen several of those kind of pop up over the years. So just kind of continuing off that, the second question is kind of related, is like, would you, for this audience, maybe it's not necessarily literally you, but for folks that have maybe less experience building design systems, would you encourage them to take the kind of start from scratch and try to have multiple device types kind of roll into a single library, or would you encourage them to lean more into just start by leaning into iOS and Android and all those things? And I guess if at an and I'll preface that and I'll add a layer to that, just like if you assume that organizationally you can make either one make sense, so it really just becomes about skill, because obviously this is also kind of a one-way door from an organizational point of view, but just like surely from building the skill point of view.
Yes, sure. It depends ultimately on what it is I think you need to build, and how quickly you need to build it, and how easy you need updates to be. It's actually, I think the gap between native and web has closed a bit over the years. It used to be that you would build HTML experiences and sort of frame them up in an app, because that freed you from having to ship a new binary off to an app store. But with some of the technologies that exist now out there, you can actually do front-end updates without having to ship a binary. So that's something that's closed down. I think, and there's probably experts on this call who know a lot more about this than I do, but things like hooks into native capabilities of the OS, like camera or things like that, have also sort of been closed. So I think ultimately it just comes down to like how obviously you're not going to build a game in a HTML technology. People have tried it. I've yet to see one sort of work super well. So those native capabilities often work better for those. So I mean, so ultimately it just comes down to like, what are you trying to build, and what do you actually need it to do, and how quickly you need to do it. And I'm just going to use that to punt to the next question.
That makes sense. It depends. All right. Let's see. From Alex, does the design system need to be pixel perfect, or is it just kind of like an approximation of what it's going to look like?
I think if it's not pixel perfect, then you are missing out on one of the primary benefits, which is quality at scale. We haven't really touched on this too much. I sort of am of the belief that a design system isn't really a system if it's just design tools or a style guide, and it's got to be instantiated in code for it truly to be a system. In which case, if it's instantiated in code, I think it's got to be pixel perfect, or you're not shipping the sort of highest quality work that you need to.
Good answer. Thank you for that. When working in a team and you actually have like a dedicated visual designer, what do you think each designer's role is under that design system? Like who should be kind of like driving it?
Yeah, the way that I split it off in both of the teams that I worked with was the visual designer drove a lot of those foundational style properties that I talked about at the beginning. So again, sort of that approach to color, that approach to elevation, that approach to shape and to spacing into your grid. Whereas our UX designers were much more about sort of the human computer interaction pieces, how, whether or not thinking through like what's our recommendation about when to use toggles versus set of check boxes. A lot more of the sort of interaction design work that goes into it. And that was sort of roughly the sort of split that we made. Now, that being said, I think we all live in a world where visual design and interaction design, or just general UX design, it's just no clean differentiation. So
yeah,
I would also say at the same time, in the teams that I've worked on, the visual designers picked up pieces that you would maybe normally expect an interaction designer to handle, and interaction designers are also there with the visual designer, sort of providing feedback, and in some cases lending a helping hand too. So it's not as clean as maybe we might envision it to be.
Yeah, like the interaction designers are picking up some of the visual work, and the visual designers are picking up some of the interaction work. Yeah, like I mean, ideally you should be doing it as a studio. So like, the less you can silo it out, like in my experience, like
totally,
because some people a lot of the time, like they've historically been a visual designer, their title is visual designer, but sometimes a design system is a great opportunity for them to kind of demonstrate to the group that, hey, like I can do more than just visual design, and vice versa. Like as an interaction designer, sometimes you want a break to actually get to do some pixel work, so it's nice to actually get some hands-on time doing visual design.
Yeah, and when I was on the ops design system, our front end engineers who were building the stuff out they were part of the team. Like we all reported. Well, most of the people reported to the same manager, and so even our front end engineers were coming in saying like, I'm not sure your contrast is right here. Like you better check that, or boy, this is a 4 pixel radius, but this other thing over here seems to be 8. Is that right? And the best environments are where those roles are super fluid and you're checking in every single day, and it's the most fun too. So
yeah, and anytime your engineers are checking you on accessibility, you're in a good place.
Totally.
All right. Amy asks, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase this. Have you ever seen ethics and integrity kind of be a factor in a design system? And if you wanted them to be, how would you build them?
Ooh,
Build them in.
that is a great question. I haven't ever seen, I have close access to material these days, and obviously Amazon and Google. I haven't seen ethics and integrity really enter into the conversation around design systems. I think that's probably because those running design systems sort of think of themselves as a little bit upstream or downstream, down the stack. What's the
Probably
top of
down
the stack here?
Yeah.
I don't know. Down the stack from the actual experiences being built with them is where some of the thornier issues, the ethical issues, considerations that one has to think about sort of come into play. But how would one actually go about it? That's a great question. I think that the best design systems are opinionated, insofar as because they have to be to express a brand in order to, really tell designers and engineers how to solve a problem. And so I think a design system could theoretically be opinionated about sort of the larger UX issues that it is helping teams to build. So in that sense, it could be, we've in the design systems I've worked with, we've always had a little bit of like, what is the prevailing philosophy of this system is sort of some of the documentation used largely as part of an onboarding onto the system. But I think that you could see that being sort of documented in the same way.
Yeah, I can imagine it like appearing in the, it's pretty common to see like, when you're doing an overview of a pattern, you got your little, do use it this way, don't use it this way. Like I can imagine that like evolving if, like ethics or integrity was like in the actual principles of the entire guideline of just like, here's an example of how to turn this pattern dark, right? Like here's how not to use the breadcrumb, in more depth than just like a single static screenshot. But yeah, Amy, to like there's opportunity there, but yeah, it's not super common.
But I think the way that I actually was thinking about it in sort of these larger terms, like I think as designers out in the world now, a lot of us are thinking a lot more about sort of the downstream super systemic issues of the choices that we make and trying to envision how they can go wrong. And that's sort of where my mind went initially. But I think you bring up another interesting thing, which is, there is opportunity just in sort of at the component level of documentation to make sure that you're steering people away from dark patterns, in terms of content, in terms of interrupters or other things that can be perceived negatively. So there's certainly those we have documented those in sort of all of the places I've ever spent time. So
all right, moving on. How do you collect feedback and kind of like update the design system like kind of more regularly? So like what are the mechanisms that you introduce to kind of like make sure that the design system stays as living documentation?
Yeah, I've developed a point of view, a strongly held point of view over the years that you're better off doing continual release cycles of design systems and versioning components out individually as opposed to sort of at the entire set level. So that, number one, I think you're conveying that this is fresh, this is supported, but also number two, so that you're not, again, sort of trapping sort of teams in places they don't want to be trapped. Sort of implicit in that is a degree of autonomy for individual teams. That's always been the case at the organizations I've worked at. We've always tried to get people on like, everybody use these buttons, but it sort of doesn't always work that way. And then the other piece of that is like, what is your communication mechanism? I feel that like you have to do a degree of push and you have to degree of pull in terms of communications. Pull meaning, soliciting from your user base feedback in the form of regular surveys or sort of other sort of research methods. Is that pull here, pulling from them? But then also you want to have a place where anybody can go and sort of file a bug or file a request. And so using, some sort of issue tracker or Jira type system in order to just sort of compile that backlog. And then just being super transparent about what that backlog is and when you're going to ship it. That's sort of another big important piece.
Piggybacking off of that, a great, like you mentioned surveys and stuff, like Eugene asked a great question here, like how do you measure the success of your design system?
Ooh, yeah, that is something that that's hard. It's really hard. And I've seen people struggle with it again and again and again and again. I think it first and foremost, sort of, you have to first determine what I think success is. Right? Like,
so how do you determine that?
Is success? I mean, success is going to be driven not entirely by the team, but also by all of the users. And so success can be viewed through, again, the lens of efficiency. It can be viewed through the lens of coverage. How much are people able to build from what you've provided? It can also be viewed through the lens of whatever business goals your organization is trying to drive. Are these parts helping us drive more revenue, more conversion, more engagement, whatever your metric is? It could also be viewed through a brand perspective. Are we expressing the brand in a way that that sort of meets the, sort of matches what we want to say or how we want to, communicate about our company? And I think you have to pick the things that are most important for you and then find the ways to measure them. In terms of efficiency, the way that we did on the ops side was through a quarterly self-reported survey. It wasn't, super quantitatively rigorous because it was, we asked engineers to basically self-report on how much efficiency gains they thought they were getting out of it. And then sort of in aggregate, we were looking at them, but we knew it wasn't the most sort of buttoned up way to do things, but it was a better signal than no signal at all. Brand is going to be much more of sort of a mass quantitative survey out into the world over time, marked previous versus new, all of that. You can also look at it through the lens of usability, and those can be run via qualitative. It's, ultimately there's a bunch of different ways. You just have to sort of pick and then find the right tool. But again, it comes down to what does the organization need from it and what is important to the organization, and that ultimately should be your guide on how you measure and think about it.
Does that always have to have a KPI, or can it be softer than that?
Again, it comes down to what is your organization? How does your organization think about those things, right? Just what is leadership asking of you? Do you have to prove your worth out, or are they taking you on faith that what you're doing is good and right and just?
Cool. Last question for you, Chris, and it's a softball. Are there any like books, resources, anything like that you would recommend that helped you kind of like hone your craft on the design system side, but also grow into a leader?
I mean, I everything Nathan Curtis has written. Nathan Curtis, for those of folks who aren't familiar with him, he is he's one of the founders of a consultancy out in the world called 8 Shapes with another sort of luminary in UX named Dan Brown. And he's, to me, he's the authority. And he basically has written, dozens of really, really sort of just solid articles on design systems. I actually think you put those all together and you have the best single book on design systems that exists today. Another guy, Brad Frost, has written one called Atomic Design, which is super influential. It basically provides the conceptual scaffolding for the sort of atoms to organisms to, I forget all the terms. So that one is a good one too. And then, there's there's one other that I picked up recently and began reading, but I can't for the life of me remember the author. So I can provide that back to the group after this is all done.
Yeah, if you do eventually remember, you can just post it to the group.
The other book that I would recommend that folks, this one sort of is not about design systems at all, but I find the book super great. I actually have it right here. Actually, I don't. It's in the other room. But in this question of like, what does a lead do versus a non-lead, or what does a principal do versus a non-lead? Peter Merholtz wrote a book called, God, it was called Designing the Design Org, or something along those lines. If you want to, if you're interested in leadership, design leadership generally, or you want to make a move into management at some point specifically, that's a great book just to get sort of a general overview of how you think about where these different individual roles sort of sit in the context of design organizations. Org Design for Design Org, thank you.
Org Design for Design Orgs.
Yeah, oh, it's Fingbo. Hey, yeah. Org Design for Design Orgs. Good reference book. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and like for one more that I toss in there is I forgot who the author was, but a book. If you go to bookapart.com, they've got a nice tight little read on if you just need a primer and you just want to breeze through something, kind of wrap your head around it. That was how I wrap my head around design systems.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Super. Yeah,
Chris.
O'Reilly, Peter Merholtz, and Kristen. That's right. Yeah. Hey.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be respectful of your time.
Man, I hope this was worth everybody's hour. So thanks everybody for coming.
I think that you just put everyone through like a solid month's worth of boot camping in like whatever this was, like an hour. So like there's going to be a recording of this. Everyone that registered, you're going to get an email that has a link to the recording. Make sure to connect with Chris Bell on LinkedIn, and make sure to thank him and let him know that this was how this was a meaningful session to you. And again, if you're interested in watching previous sessions of this, as well as other career tips, or you just want to book some time for mentorship, go to uxcandor.com. All right, everybody, it's always a pleasure, and hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, Yuri. Thanks, everybody.